I knew the night was headed for disaster long before anyone dropped a glass, raised their voice, or made a scene. You learn to recognize certain patterns when you spend your whole life being the person everyone overlooks. Families have habits. They repeat the same roles so often that eventually everyone starts performing them without thinking. There is the favorite child, the successful child, the difficult child, the disappointment, the peacemaker. By the time I was 32 years old, my role had been assigned so firmly that nobody ever questioned it. I was the daughter who worked hard but somehow never impressed anyone. The engagement celebration for my younger sister was being held at a luxury country estate just outside the city. The place looked like something pulled from a magazine. Chandeliers hung from vaulted ceilings. Servers moved silently between guests carrying silver trays. Every corner seemed designed for photographs. My sister loved that kind of attention. If admiration were a currency, she would have been the richest person in the room. Her name was Madison, and according to my family, Madison could do no wrong. I stood near one side of the reception hall helping where I could. Even though I was a guest, I had fallen into my usual role, carrying things, solving problems, making myself useful without drawing attention. Meanwhile, Madison floated through the crowd in a sparkling dress, greeting relatives and accepting compliments as naturally as breathing. Her fiancé, Lieutenant Commander Ethan Brooks, came from a respected military family. Since his arrival earlier that evening, my relatives had practically been tripping over themselves trying to impress him. My father laughed loudly at every joke Ethan made. My uncles suddenly became experts on military history. Even relatives who normally argued with each other were temporarily united by their desire to appear important in front of him. I watched all of it quietly from a distance. That had become my survival strategy years ago. Silence attracted fewer attacks. Unfortunately, it never prevented them entirely. At one point, one of my cousins approached with a polite smile. "So Rachel, are you still doing security work?" I nodded. "Yeah." Before I could say anything else, Madison leaned into the conversation. "Rachel always makes it sound more impressive than it is." Several nearby relatives turned toward us. Madison smiled sweetly. She basically spends her days checking IDs and watching cameras. A few people laughed. Nothing cruel enough to be called bullying, just enough to remind me where I stood. I kept my expression calm. Years earlier, comments like that would have ruined my entire evening. Now they barely surprised me. Dad joined the conversation. "Well, at least it is steady work." More laughter. "Jobs are hard to find these days." She was fortunate to get something stable. Fortunate, that word landed differently than they intended. Fortunate was not the word I would have chosen. Fortunate did not describe 16-hour shifts. Fortunate did not describe working holidays while everyone else celebrated. Fortunate did not describe standing outside government facilities in freezing weather, while executives drove through security gates without even acknowledging the people protecting them. But correcting them felt pointless. They had already decided who I was. Madison crossed one leg over the other and looked toward Ethan. "Honestly, when we were younger, I used to tell Rachel nobody wanted to date female security officers." The room exploded with laughter. She shrugged dramatically. "I thought men might get intimidated." Even some of Ethan's relatives laughed politely. Then my father delivered the comment that finally made my stomach tighten. "She should be grateful anyone respectable gives her a second look." The words hung in the air. A few guests shifted uncomfortably. Others pretended not to notice. I looked down at my plate, not because I was embarrassed, because I knew if I looked directly at them, they would eventually have to confront what they were doing. Most people would rather continue being cruel than feel ashamed. Across the table, Ethan had gone completely silent. At first, I barely noticed. Military officers tend to carry themselves with controlled discipline. Their movements are measured. Their expressions are usually careful. But something about his attention felt different now. He was studying me, not with pity, not with curiosity, recognition. The realization made me uneasy. Madison continued entertaining the crowd. "Rachel was always so serious growing up. You would think she was guarding state secrets or something." Several people laughed again. Then Ethan spoke. "Maybe she was." The room immediately grew quiet. Madison blinked. "What?" Ethan carefully set down his glass. His voice remained calm. 3 years ago, did you work at the Federal Transportation Command Center outside Northridge?" Every muscle in my body tightened. I answered cautiously. "Yes." My father frowned. "How do you know where she worked?" Ethan ignored the question. "A security incident occurred there during a classified transfer operation." The room became still. I felt my heartbeat quicken. Very few people knew about that event. Everyone involved had signed extensive confidentiality agreements afterward. The public never heard about it. Most employees never discussed it again. Ethan continued. "There was a communications failure. Multiple systems went offline simultaneously. Panic spread throughout the facility. Nobody interrupted him. Nobody moved. Several guests looked completely confused. Others sensed something important was happening. During the emergency, several senior personnel abandoned established protocol. His eyes briefly met mine. One person did not. I wished he would stop talking, not because I was ashamed, because I knew exactly where this was heading. Madison's smile had vanished. Dad shifted uncomfortably. There must be some misunderstanding. There is not. Ethan spoke with absolute certainty. She maintained access control during the entire breach attempt. She prevented unauthorized entry into a restricted section until response teams regained control of the facility. One of my aunts looked stunned. Was she in danger? Potentially. The room seemed frozen. Ethan folded his hands behind his back unconsciously, a habit from years of military service. The official review board specifically commended her actions under pressure. Nobody said a word. I watched my father's face change. It happened gradually, like someone discovering they had been reading the wrong map for years. You could almost see old assumptions collapsing in real time. Finally he spoke. Why didn't she tell us? The question nearly made me laugh, not because it was funny, because he asked it as if he had ever shown interest, as if he had ever sat down and asked about my life, as if he had ever wanted to hear the answer. Ethan's voice softened. People in those positions rarely talk about what happened. The silence afterward felt heavier than any argument. Suddenly everyone had questions. Were you recognized? Did you receive an award? Why didn't you tell us? Was it dangerous? What happened afterward? For years, nobody had cared enough to ask me anything. Now they leaned forward like eager students. The attention felt hollow. Respect that arrives only after outside validation is difficult to enjoy. Madison suddenly pushed back her chair. This is ridiculous. Nobody responded. She looked pale beneath her makeup. For years she had been the center of every room she entered. Tonight the spotlight had shifted, just slightly, and she had no idea how to handle it. A moment later she lost her balance. Guests rushed toward her immediately. Panic erupted. Someone shouted for water. Another called for help. My father moved toward her automatically. Then something unexpected happened. Halfway across the room, he stopped. He turned and looked directly at me. Not through me, not around me, at me. It was the first time I could remember seeing genuine confusion in his eyes. Almost as if he had suddenly realized he knew absolutely nothing about one of his own daughters. Unfortunately, I could not solve that problem for him. Outside, the evening air felt cool and refreshing after the chaos inside. I stood alone near the entrance gates watching headlights move along distant roads. Several minutes later, Ethan joined me. Neither of us spoke immediately. Then he smiled. I recognized your name the moment I arrived tonight. I nodded. I figured. He looked toward the building. Honestly, I hoped your family would speak about you differently before I had to. I followed his gaze. They never do. His expression tightened slightly. Not with pity, with disappointment. For some reason, that felt worse. Inside the building, the celebration continued struggling back toward normal. Families are remarkably talented at surviving uncomfortable truths. They reshape them, edit them, retell them. Eventually they create a version everyone can live with. A few moments later, my father stepped outside. For years, whenever tension appeared in our family, I had been expected to smooth things over, to forgive quickly, to stay quiet, to make everyone comfortable. This time I refused. Dad opened his mouth, then closed it again. For perhaps the first time in his life, he did not know what to say. I waited. Nothing came, so I walked toward my car. And when I reached him, something happened that had never happened before. My father stepped aside, not because he had to, because he chose to. For most people, it would have seemed insignificant. For me, it felt like the end of an era. The next morning my phone would not stop ringing. Relatives suddenly wanted details. People who had barely acknowledged me for years now acted fascinated by my life. But the truth was simple. The most important thing that happened that night was not the story Ethan revealed. It was finally understanding that my worth had never depended on whether my family could see it. They had spent decades looking directly at me without truly noticing who I was. That was their failure, not mine. And for the first time in my life, I stopped carrying the burden of proving myself to people who had already decided not to look. The strange thing about respect is that it becomes far less important the moment you stop chasing it. That night my family finally saw me, but by then, I no longer needed them to.